The small coastal town of Pine Harbor was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Nestled between rolling hills and the vast ocean, it was home to families who had lived there for generations. Among them were the Morales family, known throughout town for their kindness and hard work. Eduardo Morales wasn't born in Pine Harbor, but after 27 years of living there, he was as much a part of the town as anyone. He had moved there as a young man, falling in love with both the peaceful way of life and a local girl named Lucia. Their romance had been the talk of the town, the handsome newcomer with warm eyes and the beautiful daughter of the local bakery owner. Life had been good to Eduardo and Lucia at first. They married under the old oak tree by the harbor, with half the town in attendance. They bought a modest house on Cedar Lane, just a short walk from the water. Eduardo took up fishing, learning the trade from Lucia's uncle who owned a small fishing boat. For 2 years they lived in perfect happiness, planning for the family they dreamed of having. When Lucia became pregnant, their joy knew no bounds. The news of twins made it even more special. Eduardo would come home from long days at sea and place his weathered hands on Lucia's growing belly, feeling his son's kick and move. They painted a room blue and filled it with 2 of everything. 2 cribs, 2 tiny fishing-themed mobiles, 2 stuffed bears. But fate can be cruel in its timing. What should have been the happiest day of their lives turned into Eduardo's darkest nightmare. There were complications during the birth. While his sons came into the world healthy and crying, Lucia slipped away despite the doctor's best efforts. Eduardo became both a father and a widower on the same day. The town rallied around the young father. Neighbors brought meals, offered to watch the babies, and helped in any way they could. Eduardo named his identical sons Miguel and Marco, names Lucia had chosen months before. Though overwhelmed with grief and the sudden responsibility of raising 2 infants alone, Eduardo was determined to give his boys the life Lucia would have wanted for them. As the years passed, Eduardo poured everything into raising his sons. He rearranged his fishing schedule so he could be home more, often taking the twins with him on his boat once they were old enough. By the time they were 10, Miguel and Marco were as comfortable on water as they were on land. "Dad, I caught one," Miguel would shout, his fishing line tugging with the weight of a catch. "Mine's bigger," Marco would counter, competitive as always. Eduardo would watch them with pride swelling in his chest, seeing pieces of Lucia in their smiles and the way they tilted their heads when concentrating, though identical in appearance, both with their mother's dark curly hair and Eduardo's deep-set eyes. Their personalities emerged as different as could be. Miguel was thoughtful and careful, planning his actions before taking them. Marco was bold and spontaneous, jumping into situations head first. The people of Pine Harbor watched the twins grow from tiny babies to energetic boys to responsible young men. They became fixtures in town life, helping elderly Mrs. Patel carry her groceries, volunteering at the annual harbor cleanup, and joining their father at church every Sunday. By their 25th birthday, they were working full-time alongside Eduardo on what was now their family fishing boat, which they had named Lucia's Grace. On the morning that would change everything, there was nothing to suggest it would be different from any other day. The sky was painted in shades of pink, and orange as dawn broke over Pine Harbor. A light fog hung over the water, common for March in that part of the coast. Eduardo, now 53 with streaks of silver in his once jet-black hair, checked the weather report over breakfast. "Looks clear until afternoon," he told his sons as they ate the eggs and toast he had prepared. "We should be back before any weather moves in." Miguel glanced out the window, a slight frown crossing his face. "The fog's thicker than they predicted." "It'll burn off once the sun's up properly," Marco said, already standing to clear his plate. "We should get going if we want to hit that spot you found last week, Dad." Eduardo nodded, though something made him pause as he looked at his sons. Maybe it was the way the early morning light caught their profiles, or perhaps some instinct he couldn't name, but for a moment they looked so much like Lucia that it made his heart ache. He'd never remarried, never even dated seriously. His life had been his boys and the sea. "You two go ahead and get the boat ready," Eduardo said. "I need to grab something from upstairs." In his bedroom, Eduardo opened the top drawer of his dresser and took out a small wooden box. Inside was Lucia's wedding ring, which he'd kept all these years. He wasn't sure why, but he felt compelled to bring it with him today. He slipped it into his pocket, next to the St. Christopher medal he always carried for safe passage on the water. By the time Eduardo joined his sons at the harbor, they had already loaded the day's supplies onto Lucia's Grace. The 28-foot fishing boat wasn't fancy, but it was well maintained and had served them reliably for years. The twins moved around the vessel with the ease of men who knew every inch of their workplace. "Bait's fresh," Marco reported. "Tank's full. We're good. To go." Eduardo nodded, taking his place at the helm. As they pulled away from the dock, several other fishermen called out greetings or waved. It was a close community, these men and women who made their living from the sea. They looked out for each other, respected the unwritten rules of their profession, and shared both the bounty and hardships that came with it. The fog was indeed thicker than usual as they made their way out of the harbor and into open water. Eduardo navigated confidently, knowing these waters like the back of his hand. They traveled for about an hour before reaching the spot Eduardo had discovered the previous week, a place where the fish had been plentiful. Should be a good haul. "Today," Eduardo said as they dropped anchor. "Water temperature's perfect." The morning passed pleasantly as they worked. The fog lifted as Marco had predicted, revealing a sky of perfect blue. They caught enough fish to make the trip worthwhile. Working in the comfortable rhythm they had developed over years of doing this together, they ate the sandwiches they had packed for lunch, sitting on the deck and talking about town gossip. "Did you hear Tomas and Nita are expecting again?" Miguel mentioned. "That'll be number 4, Eduardo chuckled. "His father says Tomas is trying to field his own baseball team." It was around 2 in the afternoon when Eduardo first noticed the change in the sky. Dark clouds had appeared on the horizon, moving faster than seemed natural. He frowned. The weather report had mentioned a possibility of showers later, but this looked more serious. "We should head back," he said, interrupting Marco's story about the new waitress at the diner who had caught his eye. Both twins looked where their father was pointing. Miguel immediately began securing their catch, while Marco went to pull up the anchor. "Weather's turning quicker than they said it would," Miguel observed, his voice calm, but his movements efficient. As they started the journey back to Pine Harbor, the wind picked up dramatically. What had been gentle swells became choppy waves that slapped against the hull of their boat. Eduardo gripped the wheel tighter, his experienced hands making constant adjustments. "It'll be rough for a bit," he called over the increasing noise of the wind. "But we'll be fine." The rain started when they were still about 40 minutes from the harbor. Fat, heavy drops that stung when they hit exposed skin. Soon it was a downpour, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Eduardo turned on the boat's lights despite it being daytime. Miguel was checking their radio, which had begun to crackle with static. "Harbor's issuing a small craft warning," he reported. "Storm came in faster than anyone expected." Eduardo nodded grimly. He had weathered many storms in his years at sea, but something about this one felt different. The waves were growing higher, some washing over the sides of the boat now. He thought of Lucia's ring in his pocket and felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his jacket. "Secure everything," he instructed his sons, "and put on your life vests." Neither son argued, which told Eduardo they too sensed the seriousness of their situation. As Miguel and Marco moved around the pitching deck, Eduardo fought to keep the boat steady. A particularly large wave crashed over them, momentarily flooding the deck. "Dad," Marco called out, pointing to their right. Eduardo turned just in time to see a massive wave building, much larger than the others. In that moment, as the wall of water rose beside them, a strange calm settled over him. He thought of Lucia, of the boys' first steps, first days of school, first fishing trips. He thought of all the years he'd had with them, more than he'd had with their mother, but still not enough, never enough. "Hold on," Eduardo shouted as the wave crashed down upon Lucia's Grace. The force of the water was tremendous. Eduardo felt the boat lift and roll. He heard the twins shouting, saw Marco reaching for Miguel. Then everything was water and noise and confusion. The cold shock of the ocean stole his breath as he was thrown overboard. Despite the chaos, Eduardo's first thought was of his sons. He fought to surface, lungs burning, eyes stinging from the salt water. When he broke through to air, he called their names, his voice lost in the howling wind. Through sheets of rain, he caught glimpses of the boat, capsized now, its hull visible above the churning waves. "Miguel! Marco!" Eduardo screamed, swimming toward the overturned vessel with strength born of desperation. Back in Pine Harbor, the storm had caused the townspeople to worry about those who were out at sea. By nightfall, when Lucia's Grace hadn't returned, the Coast Guard was called. Search boats went out despite the dangerous conditions, their powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness. They searched all night, the people of Pine Harbor gathering at the docks despite the rain, waiting for news. As dawn broke the next morning, bringing with it calmer seas and clearing skies, word came in from one of the search vessels. They had found Lucia's Grace, or what remained of her, and they had found Eduardo and his sons, the 3 men who had left harbor the previous morning full of life and plans would never return home again. News travels fast in small towns. By mid-morning, everyone in Pine Harbor knew about the tragedy. The Morales men, Eduardo and his twin sons, Miguel and Marco, gone in a single night. The town that had watched the twins grow from babies to men now gathered to mourn them. The community center became the unofficial meeting place. People brought food as they always did in times of sorrow. Plates of homemade bread, casseroles still warm from the oven, and sweet pastries lined the tables, though few had any appetite. They came to be together, to share their grief, and to figure out what happens next when a family that was so woven into the fabric of their town suddenly unravels. "I just saw them at the hardware store on Tuesday," said Hector, the town's only plumber. He shook his head, coffee cup clutched between his weathered hands. Marco was joking about fixing their leaky sink before the fish started swimming through their kitchen. Beside him, his wife Rosa dabbed at her eyes. Those boys were like nephews to us all, always ready with a smile or a helping hand. Similar conversations echoed throughout the room. Stories of Eduardo teaching Sunday school at the church, of Miguel quietly paying for Mrs. Wilson's groceries when her Social Security check was late, of Marco organizing a beach cleanup after last year's big storm. The twins had been different in personality but identical in their goodness, a testament to how Eduardo had raised them. By afternoon, practical matters needed attention. Someone had to arrange the funeral. Someone had to deal with the house on Cedar Lane, now empty of its occupants but full of their belongings. Someone had to notify family. "Does Eduardo have any living relatives?" Mayor Thompson asked the gathered crowd. There was a moment of murmuring before Dora Alvarez, who had been the town's librarian for 30 years, spoke up. "He has a sister, Elena. Lives somewhere out west, I think. They weren't close, but they exchanged Christmas cards. Eduardo showed me a photo of her once. This sparked a search through town records. Eventually, they found contact information for Elena Morales, now Elena Reyes, living in Arizona. The mayor made the difficult call. 3 days later, Elena arrived in Pine Harbor. She was clearly Eduardo's sister. They shared the same strong jawline and deep-set eyes, but where Eduardo had been warm and open, Elena seemed guarded. Life had hardened her in ways it hadn't him. Still, beneath her reserved exterior, her grief was evident in the shadows under her eyes and the tightness around her mouth. "I haven't seen my brother in almost 15 years, she told Mayor Thompson as he drove her from the small regional airport to Pine Harbor. "We spoke on the phone at Christmas, sent birthday cards. You know how it is. You mean to visit, to stay close, but life gets in the way." The mayor nodded sympathetically. "Eduardo spoke of you fondly." Elena gazed out the window at the coastline coming into view. "We grew up in a small town too, though nothing as pretty as this. Eduardo always loved the water. Even as a kid, he was happiest at the lake near our house." She paused, swallowing hard. "I should have visited, met his boys properly. Now it's too late." Mayor Thompson had arranged for Elena to stay with Dora Alvarez, who had a spare room and a kind heart. When they arrived at Dora's cozy house, Elena asked to go to Eduardo's home first. "I need to see where my brother lived," she explained. Where? They all lived. The house on Cedar Lane stood silent, waiting. Elena hesitated at the front door, the key the mayor had given her heavy in her hand. Finally, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The home told the story of the family who had lived there. Photos covered the walls, Eduardo and his wife, on their wedding day, the twins as babies, toddlers, teenagers, young men. The three of them on their boat, at community events, living their ordinary, precious lives. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the kitchen table. 3 coffee mugs hung on hooks by the sink, one chipped, one with "World's Best Dad" printed on it, one with the local high school's logo. Elena moved through the room slowly, touching things. A flannel shirt draped over a chair that still smelled like her brother's aftershave. A guitar that must have belonged to one of the twins. Fishing gear neatly organized in the mudroom. In the living room, she found herself facing a portrait of a beautiful young woman. "Lucia," she whispered. Eduardo's wife, the twins' mother, who had died bringing them into the world. Elena had never met her sister-in-law, had only seen photos. The distance between her and Eduardo had begun around the time he met Lucia, not because of any dislike, but because Elena's life had pulled her away just as Eduardo's life in Pine Harbor was beginning. As the afternoon light faded, Elena sat on the porch of her brother's empty house, watching the ocean that had given him both his livelihood and ultimately taken his life. That's where Dora found her, silent tears tracking down her face. "The funeral home called," Dora said gently. "They'd like you to come in tomorrow to make arrangements." Elena nodded, wiping her cheeks. "Is there a tradition here? For fishermen who die at sea?" "Yes," Dora replied. "But first, let's get you some dinner. You'll need your strength for the days ahead." The following morning, Elena met with Howard Bell, the town's funeral director. His family had run Bell Funeral Home for generations, and Howard himself had known Eduardo well. They had played cards together monthly. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Howard said, his tone sincere rather than professionally polished. "Eduardo was a good man, those boys too." "Thank you," Elena replied. "This is all so sudden, I'm not sure what Eduardo would have wanted." Howard nodded understanding. "In Pine Harbor, there's a tradition for those lost at sea. A 3-day wake, allowing the community time to pay their respects. Then a procession to the cemetery on the hill, the one that overlooks the harbor." "That sounds appropriate," Elena said. Eduardo loved this town. He'd want to follow its traditions. They discussed details. Flowers? Local wildflowers, rather. Then formal arrangements. Music? Miguel had played guitar in the church band. Photographs to display. Howard explained that the bodies had been recovered and were being prepared. "Would you like to see them?" he asked gently. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I need to." Howard led her to a private viewing room. 3 caskets stood open. Elena approached slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked first at Eduardo. Her big brother appeared peaceful, as if sleeping. The years had changed him. More lines around his eyes than she remembered, gray threading through his dark hair. But she could still see the boy who had protected her from bullies and taught her to ride a bike. "Oh, Eddie," she whispered, using the childhood nickname only she had ever called him. Then she turned to look at her nephews. In death, their identical nature was even more pronounced. Both handsome young men with their father's strong features and their mother's softer eyes. Men she had never really known, whose birthday cards she had signed and sent without truly knowing their dreams, fears, favorite foods, or chosen paths. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," she told them quietly. "I'm sorry I'll never know you now." The wake began that evening. As was tradition in Pine Harbor, it would last 3 days, giving everyone, from the closest friends to casual acquaintances, time to pay their respects. The funeral home opened its doors and people began to arrive. They came in waves, fishermen still in their work clothes, having come straight from their boats. Elderly residents leaning on canes, families with children who had known the twins as their soccer coaches. teenagers who had worked summer jobs at the docks alongside the Morales men. Elena stood near the caskets, accepting condolences from people who knew her brother and nephews far better than she did. Each person who approached had a story to share. Eduardo helped me rebuild my porch after the hurricane 2 years ago. Wouldn't take a dime for it, said one man. Marco tutored my son in math when he was struggling, brought his grades up from failing to a B, a mother told her. Miguel drove me to my doctor's appointments in the city when my daughter couldn't get time off work, an elderly woman said, patting Elena's hand. As the evening progressed, Elena noticed groups of people huddled in conversation, occasionally, glancing toward the caskets with puzzled expressions. Curious, she approached one such group, 3 older men who had been introduced to her as fellow fishermen who had worked alongside Eduardo for decades. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The men exchanged glances before the oldest, a weather-beaten man named Joseph, spoke. "Not wrong exactly, just strange. I was just telling the fellas, I saw Eduardo last week at the diner. He seemed tired. Mentioned he'd been having these chest pains. Nothing serious, he said, just getting old." Another man nodded. "Thing is, I heard Marco complaining of the same thing when we were fixing nets at the dock. Said it ran in the family, but not to worry about it." The third man added, "And I overheard Miguel telling the pharmacist he needed something stronger for heartburn that wouldn't react with his new medication. Didn't think much of it at the time." Elena frowned. "Did my brother have heart problems?" Joseph shrugged. Not that he ever mentioned directly. Eduardo was private about health stuff, stubborn about seeing doctors too. As the evening wore on, Elena heard similar comments from others. It seemed both twins had mentioned chest pains or heart issues in the weeks before the accident. One of the nurses from the local clinic approached Elena near the end of the first night of the wake. "I shouldn't say anything," the nurse, a woman named Beth, whispered. "Patient confidentiality and all. But seeing as they're gone now and your family, your brother came in for tests a couple months back. Seemed worried. Dr. Wang referred him to a specialist in the city." Elena thanked her for the information, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. As the funeral home emptied for the night, she found herself alone with her thoughts and the bodies of her brother and nephews. She studied their peaceful faces, wondering what secrets they had taken with them. "What weren't you telling anyone, Eddie?" she whispered to her brother's still form. "And what happened out there on that boat?" Little did she know. The answers would be more shocking than she could imagine, and the truth would come to light in ways that would leave the entire town of Pine Harbor reeling. The second day of the wake brought even more visitors than the first. People from neighboring towns who had known the Morales family through business or church came to pay their respects. The funeral home was filled with flowers, photographs, and the soft murmur of shared memories. Elena stood by the caskets, exhausted, but determined to honor her brother and nephews properly. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing, with questions about what she'd heard regarding Eduardo's health and that of the twins. It seemed odd that all 3 men would complain of similar symptoms in the weeks before their deaths. Around noon, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun approached Elena. She walked with a slight limp and carried a small, worn photo album. "You must be Elena," the woman said, her voice warm but tired. "I'm Dr. Wang. I was your brother's physician for many years." Elena straightened. This was the doctor the nurse had mentioned the previous evening. "Thank you for coming. I understand my brother saw you recently?" Dr. Wang glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private?" They found a small room at the back of the funeral home, used for families needing a moment away from the main gathering. Once the door closed behind them, Dr. Wang's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I retired last year," she explained. "But I kept a few patients who had been with me for decades. Eduardo was one of them." She opened the photo album to reveal not family photos but a collection of old medical charts and notes. "Normally, I wouldn't discuss a patient's medical history, but under the circumstances..." Elena nodded. "I'd appreciate anything you can tell me. I've been hearing things about chest pains, heart problems." Dr. Wang sighed. 6 months ago, Eduardo came to me concerned about some symptoms he'd been experiencing. Chest tightness, shortness of breath, unusual fatigue. Given his family history, I ran some tests. Family history? Elena asked, confused. Our parents died in a car accident. There's no heart disease in our family that I know of. Not your parents, Dr. Wang clarified. Lucia's side. Eduardo told me Lucia's father and 2 uncles all died before 50 from a rare genetic heart condition. It's what ultimately took Lucia as well, though the stress of childbirth complicated matters. This was news to Elena. She'd always believed. Her sister-in-law died from childbirth complications alone. The tests confirmed Eduardo had developed the same condition, Dr. Wang continued. It's called familial cardiomyopathy, a genetic disorder that affects the heart muscle. In this particular variant, it often remains dormant until middle age, then progresses rapidly. Elena felt the room tilt slightly. And it can be passed down to children? Dr. Wang nodded solemnly. There's a 50% chance for each child to inherit it. With identical twins, if one has it, both do. Did Eduardo have the twins tested? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer from what she'd heard at the wake. He was concerned, Dr. Wang said carefully. He asked about testing procedures. I referred them all to a specialist in the city. I don't know the results, but... She hesitated. But what? Elena pressed. Eduardo came to see me one last time, about 3 weeks ago. He seemed resigned. He asked unusual questions about how the condition progresses, about pain management in late stages. When I suggested more aggressive treatment options, he changed the subject. Elena's throat tightened. You think all 3 of them had it, that they knew? Dr. Wang closed her album. I can't say for certain, but if they did, and if the twins' condition was already advancing, it would have been devastating news for Eduardo. The doctor left shortly after, leaving Elena with more questions than answers. She returned to the main room, seeing the 3 caskets in a new light. Had they known they were all ill? Had it somehow contributed to the accident? As the afternoon progressed, Elena found herself studying the faces of visitors more carefully, listening for any additional clues. Around 3 o'clock, an older man with a dignified bearing approached her. He introduced himself as Judge Holt, a longtime friend of Eduardo's. Your brother was a man of principle, the judge said. We fished together every other Saturday for nearly 20 years. Did he ever mention any health concerns to you? Elena asked directly. The judge looked surprised by the question. Not specifically, no, though. He paused, thinking. About a month ago, he did ask some unusual legal questions, about life insurance policies, about whether they pay out in certain circumstances. What circumstances? Elena asked, her unease growing. Well, the judge said, lowering his voice. He asked specifically about accidental death versus other situations. I assumed he was refinancing his house or something similar. Insurance questions are common in those cases. Before Elena could probe further, she was pulled away by the funeral director to discuss tomorrow's service. By evening, she was too exhausted to think clearly. Dora drove her back to the house where she was staying, promising to return in the morning. Alone in the guest room, Elena finally had time to process everything she'd learned. She pulled out her phone and began searching for information about familial cardiomyopathy. What she found matched what Dr. Wang had told her. It was genetic, often fatal, and treatments were limited, especially in advanced cases. She then searched Eduardo's name along with life insurance and found nothing unusual. But when she searched for information about insurance policies and accidental death, she discovered something unsettling. Many policies had specific clauses regarding self-harm. The thought that entered her mind was too terrible to consider. She pushed it away, but it lingered at the edges of her consciousness as she finally fell into a troubled sleep. The 3rd day of the wake dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day that seemed at odds with the somber occasion. Elena arrived early at the funeral home to have a few moments alone with her brother and nephews before visitors arrived. In the quiet of the viewing room, she studied their faces. The funeral director had done a good job. They looked peaceful, as if sleeping. Elena noticed something she hadn't before, a small birthmark behind Eduardo's right ear. Curious, she checked Miguel and found an identical mark in the same spot. When she saw the same birthmark on Marco, a chill ran through her. They really were so alike, came a voice from behind her. Elena turned to find an older woman watching her. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "I'm Rita," the woman said. "I cleaned house for Eduardo every other week for the past 15 years. Those boys were like grandsons to me." "Did you notice anything unusual in the weeks before the accident?" Elena asked. "Anything about their health or behavior?" Rita hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Eduardo had me clear out the medicine cabinet about a month ago, said they were spring cleaning. But I noticed the twins' bathroom had all new prescriptions. Several bottles, all with their names on them. Do you remember what they were for?" "I don't read other people's medicine bottles," Rita said primly, then softened. "But one of them dropped on the floor. Something for the heart, I think. I remember thinking it was strange for young men to need such things." Throughout the day, more people arrived to pay their respects. Elena found herself drawn to conversations with those who had seen Eduardo and the twins in the final weeks before the accident. A pattern was emerging. Subtle changes in behavior, references to health, issues, and what several people described as a peaceful acceptance that had seemed odd at the time. Late in the afternoon, Beth, the nurse who had spoken to Elena on the first night, returned. She looked nervous as she approached. "I've been thinking about what I said," she whispered, "about patient confidentiality. I could lose my job, but—" She glanced at the 3 caskets. "They deserve the truth to be known." Elena led her to the same private room where she had spoken with Dr. Wang. "What truth?" Elena asked once they were alone. Beth wrung her hands. 2 months ago, Eduardo and the twins came to the clinic together. Dr. Wang ordered tests, then referred them to a specialist in the city. I handled the paperwork. They all went together the following week. "And?" Elena prompted when Beth paused. "They came back different. Quiet. Eduardo asked me to pull their medical records, said he was getting a second opinion. It's not standard procedure, but I've known him my whole life, so I made copies." Beth looked down at her hands. A week later, the twins came in separately for new prescriptions. Heavy-duty heart medications. The kind you don't prescribe unless things are serious. Elena felt her chest tighten. "Did they say anything?" Beth nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Miguel said something I haven't been able to forget. He said, 'Some families share everything, even their endings.' I thought it was just a poetic way of dealing with bad news. But now, the implication hung in the air between them." Beth left shortly after, clearly uncomfortable with what she had shared. As the final visitors departed and the wake came to an end, Elena found Howard, the funeral director, preparing to close the caskets for tomorrow's burial service. "Wait," she said. "I'd like to see them one more time." Howard nodded understanding and left her alone with her thoughts. Elena stood before the 3 men, trying to piece together the story that was forming in her mind. She noticed something else she hadn't seen before, a faint bluish discoloration around their fingernails. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it, but it was present on all 3. "What happened out there, Eddie?" she whispered to her brother. "What really happened on that boat?" As she turned to leave, Elena spotted a small white piece of paper that had fallen from Eduardo's jacket pocket onto the satin lining of the casket. She reached for it, unfolding what appeared to be a receipt from the local pharmacy. It was dated 3 days before the accident, for 3 identical prescriptions, heart medications for Eduardo, Miguel, and Marco. But there was something odd about the quantity. The prescription was for a 30-day supply, but the receipt showed they had received only a week's worth of pills. Elena slipped the receipt into her purse, her mind racing. Tomorrow they would bury Eduardo and his sons, but she was beginning to suspect that the real story of their deaths was far more complicated and heartbreaking than a simple fishing accident, and someone in Pine Harbor might know the truth. The morning of the funeral dawned with a gentle mist hanging over Pine Harbor. Elena woke early, the pharmacy receipt she'd found still clutched in her hand. She'd fallen asleep studying it, trying to understand its significance. Why would Eduardo and his sons get only a week's supply of a 30-day prescription? And what did that timing, 3 days before the accident, mean? After a quick shower, Elena dressed in the black outfit she'd brought for the occasion. As she pinned her hair back, she caught her reflection in the mirror, the resemblance to her brother more evident than ever in the worried lines around her eyes. "I'll find out what happened, Eddie," she promised her reflection. Whatever it was, Dora was waiting downstairs with coffee and toast. Though Elena found she had little appetite, they drove to the funeral home in silence, the weight of the day ahead hanging between them. The service was scheduled for 10 o'clock, with burial to follow at the hillside cemetery overlooking the harbor. By 9:30, the funeral home was filled beyond capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in, and still people stood along the walls and spilled out onto the porch. Eduardo and his sons had been deeply loved by this community. Elena sat in the front row, feeling both surrounded by people and utterly alone. These were her brother's people, not hers. They knew stories of his life that she'd never heard, had watched his sons grow up while she'd been absent. The guilt of her long absence weighed on her as heavily as her growing suspicions. The service was simple but moving. The local pastor spoke of Eduardo's unwavering faith, of the twins' kindness and community spirit. Friends shared memories, fishing trips, community projects, small acts of generosity that had meant the world to the recipients. The high school choir, where Miguel had once been a member, sang a hymn that left few dry eyes in the room. As the service concluded, the funeral director announced that the caskets would be transported to the cemetery, where a final graveside service would be held. People began to file out, heading to their cars for the procession. Elena was about to follow when she felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find the town pharmacist, a middle-aged man named Paul, looking at her with concern. "Ms. Reyes? I'm sorry to bother you today of all days, but I heard you've been asking questions about your brother's medications." Elena nodded. "Yes, I found a receipt. It seemed unusual." Paul glanced around nervously. "It was. I've been troubled about it since I heard about the accident." He lowered his voice. "Eduardo and I went fishing together sometimes. We weren't close friends, but I respected him enormously. When he came in with that prescription for himself and the boys, something felt off." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, her heart beating faster. "It was for a 30-day supply, but he specifically asked for just 7 days' worth. Said they were trying the medication before committing to the full prescription." Paul shook his head. "It's not unheard of, but with heart medication you generally need to take it consistently to see results, and all 3 of them getting the same shortened supply? It raised flags." "Did you say anything to him?" "I tried. I asked if his doctor knew he was planning to take a reduced course. He assured me they had a follow-up appointment scheduled." Paul paused, his expression troubled. "The thing is, when I checked our records after what happened, I realized something. Based on the dosage and the quantity they took home, all 3 of them would have run out of medication the day before they went fishing." Elena felt a chill run through her. "The day before the accident?" Paul nodded grimly. "Heart medications aren't something you just stop taking, especially with their condition. The sudden discontinuation could cause arrhythmias, shortness of breath, even cardiac events. I've been wondering if maybe out on that boat—" He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Elena was already connecting the dots. "Thank you for telling me this," she said quietly. "I should have said something sooner to someone, maybe if I had—" Paul trailed off, regret evident in his voice. "It's not your fault," Elena assured him, though her mind was racing with implications. Outside, the funeral procession was forming. Black cars lined the street, their headlights on despite the morning sun now breaking through the mist. Elena found herself ushered into the lead car alongside Mayor Thompson and Pastor Wells. As they drove slowly through town toward the cemetery, Elena stared out the window at the storefronts and houses draped with black ribbons in honor of the Morales men. Her mind, however, was piecing together a different picture of her brother's final days, one that suggested the fishing accident might not have been an accident at all. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill overlooking the harbor. From this vantage point, you could see the entire town, the docks where fishing boats bobbed in the water and the open ocean beyond. It was peaceful, beautiful even. A fitting final resting place for men who had lived their lives by the sea. 3 graves had been prepared side by side. The caskets, carried by friends who had worked alongside Eduardo and his sons on the docks, were placed beside them. The crowd gathered, larger even than at the funeral home. Some people had come directly to the cemetery, unable to find space at the service. As Pastor Wells began the final prayers, Elena found herself looking not at the caskets but at the faces in the crowd. Who else might know something? Who else might have noticed something unusual in the days before the tragedy? Her gaze landed on an older man standing slightly apart from the others. He wore the weathered clothes of a fisherman, but something about his stance, formal, rigid, suggested a military background. When he caught Elena looking at him, he nodded almost imperceptibly. After the final blessing, as people began to disperse, this man approached her. Up close, she could see the years of sun and sea etched into his face. "Ms. Reyes," he said, his voice gravelly. "I'm Gabriel. I was your brother's first mate before he started taking his boys out with him." "It's nice to meet you," Elena replied. Automatically, though, she sensed this was more than a simple introduction. "I need to show you something," Gabriel said quietly. "Not here, not today, but tomorrow, if you could come to the harbor. Dock 3, early morning." Before Elena could ask what this was about, Gabriel turned and walked away, lost in the crowd of mourners heading back to their cars. The rest of the day passed in a blur of handshakes, hugs, and shared meals. The community had organized a gathering at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes brought by seemingly everyone in Pine Harbor. Elena moved through it all in a daze, her mind fixed on what Gabriel might know, and on the growing suspicion that her brother's death, and those of her nephews, had been far from accidental. As evening fell, Elena found herself back at Eduardo's house on Cedar Lane. Mayor Thompson had given her the keys, suggesting she might want to start going through her brother's belongings. "No rush," he'd assured her. "The town will help however we can." Alone, in the quiet house, Elena felt Eduardo's presence everywhere. In the books on the shelves, the coffee cup still sitting by his favorite chair, the boots lined up neatly by the door. She wandered from room to room, trailing her fingers over surfaces, opening drawers, looking for anything that might help her understand. In Eduardo's bedroom, she found a small desk tucked into the corner. It was neat, organized, much like her brother himself. A stack of bills, all paid and filed, a calendar with fishing times noted based on the tides, a drawer with pens, paper clips, the ordinary detritus of daily life. But when she tried the bottom drawer, it was locked. Elena frowned. What would Eduardo need to keep locked in his own home? The twins were adults. They surely respected his privacy. And Pine Harbor seemed like the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked at night. She searched the room for a key but found nothing. Frustrated, she sat on the edge of Eduardo's bed, trying to think like her brother. Where would he hide a key? Her eyes fell on the photograph on his nightstand, Eduardo and Lucia on their wedding day. On impulse, she picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The back of the frame came loose, and a small key fell onto the bedspread. Heart pounding, Elena returned to the desk and tried the key in the locked drawer. It fit perfectly. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal, a folder of medical documents, and a sealed envelope with her name written on it in Eduardo's neat handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter, dated 1 week before the accident. "Dear Elena," it began. "If you're reading this, then what I've planned has come to pass. I'm sorry to leave you with so many questions, with the burden of sorting through what we've left behind. But I need someone to understand why we made the choice we did." Elena gasped, nearly dropping the letter. Choice? What choice? She continued reading, her brother's words confirming her worst fears. The medical documents told the rest of the story. Test results for all 3 men showing advanced familial cardiomyopathy. The specialist's prognosis, 6 months at most for the twins, perhaps a year for Eduardo, with increasing pain and deterioration. Treatment options that might extend life slightly, but couldn't cure the condition. The journal contained Eduardo's private thoughts as he grappled with the diagnosis, his grief, his guilt at passing the condition to his sons, his determination to spare them the suffering he had witnessed Lucia endure from the same disease. The final entry, dated the night before they went fishing, was brief. Tomorrow we go home to Lucia. The sea has given us life. Now it will give us peace. The boys have agreed. It's our choice made together, as we've done everything in this life. I only pray for forgiveness for taking this path. Elena sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as the truth became clear. The accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a choice, a terrible, heartbreaking choice made by 3 men facing an unbearable end. But there was still something missing from this picture. Gabriel, Eduardo's former first mate, had said he needed to show her something. What more could there be to this tragic story? Elena tucked the letter and journal into her bag. Tomorrow she would go to the harbor and hear what Gabriel had to say. For now, she curled up on her brother's bed, surrounded by his things, and wept for the choice no family should ever have to make. Elena barely slept that night. Her brother's letter and journal lay on the nightstand beside her, their contents weighing heavily on her heart. By dawn she was already awake, watching the first light of day filter through the curtains of Eduardo's bedroom. She showered and dressed quickly, her mind focused on the meeting with Gabriel. What more could there be to this story? Eduardo's letter had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect, that he and his sons had made a terrible choice rather than face the suffering that awaited them. But Gabriel's serious expression and cryptic words suggested another piece to the puzzle. The harbor was quiet at this early hour. A few fishermen prepared their boats for the day, but most of the docks were still. Elena made her way to Dock 3, as instructed, pulling her jacket tighter against the morning chill. Gabriel was already there, sitting on a weathered bench overlooking the water. He stood as she approached, nodding and greeting. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "You said you had something to show me," Elena replied, too emotionally exhausted for small talk. Gabriel studied her face for a moment. "You figured it out, haven't you? About Eduardo and the boys?" Elena nodded, tears threatening again. "I found his journal, his letter. I know what they did, what they chose." Gabriel sighed deeply, his eyes turning toward the horizon where the rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I suspected as much when I heard about the storm. Eduardo was too good a captain to be caught unprepared like that. He knew those waters better than anyone." "Then what more is there to know?" Elena asked. "What did you want to show me?" "Come with me," Gabriel said, turning toward a small building at the end of the dock. He led her to what appeared to be a storage shed. Unlocking it, he gestured for her to enter. Inside, Elena was surprised to find not fishing equipment, but what looked like a small office. A desk sat in one corner, bookshelves lined the walls, and a large map of the coastline was pinned to one wall, marked with various notations. This was Eduardo's thinking place, Gabriel explained. Not many people knew about it. He'd come here, to be alone, to plan fishing routes to escape when the memories of Lucia got too heavy. Elena looked around in wonder. This was a side of her brother she hadn't known, a private sanctuary away from his home and family. Gabriel went to the desk and opened a drawer, removing a thick manila envelope. 3 weeks ago, Eduardo asked me to meet him here. He seemed different, calm in a way I'd never seen before. He gave me this, made me promise I wouldn't open it unless something happened to him and the boys. Said if they all went together, I should give it to you when you came for the funeral. Elena took the envelope with trembling hands. "You knew? All this time?" Gabriel shook his head firmly. "I knew something was wrong, but not what. Eduardo was a private man. If he had a burden, he carried it himself." He paused. "After the accident, I came here. Almost opened that envelope a dozen times, but a promise is a promise. Elena sank into the desk chair, staring at the envelope in her hands. It was sealed with tape, her name written across the front, in Eduardo's handwriting. After a moment's hesitation, she broke the seal and looked inside. The envelope contained several documents, legal papers it seemed, along with another sealed letter addressed to the Pine Harbor Town Council. Elena examined the legal documents first. As she read through them, her eyes widened. "This is Eduardo's will," she said, looking up at Gabriel. "He's left the house to me, but everything else, his savings, the boat insurance payout, a life insurance policy I didn't know about. It all goes to establish a medical research fund for familial cardiomyopathy research." Gabriel nodded. "That sounds like Eduardo, always thinking of others, even at the end." Elena continued reading. "There's more. A deed to a piece of land out by the lighthouse. He's donated it to the town, to be made into a park, the Miguel and Marco Morales Memorial Park." Her voice broke slightly on the twins' names. As she set aside these papers, something else caught her attention, a small voice recorder at the bottom of the envelope. She picked it up, finger hovering over the play button. "I'll give you privacy," Gabriel said, moving toward the door. "Take as long as you need. I'll be outside." Once alone, Elena pressed play. Eduardo's voice filled the small room, so clear and present it was as if he stood beside her. "Elena, my sister. If you're listening to this, then you know what happened. What we chose. I'm recording this the night before we go out on the water for the last time. The boys are at home, making peace with our decision in their own ways. Marco is playing his guitar. Miguel is writing letters to a few close friends. I need you to understand why. When the doctor told us about our condition, all three of us with the same time bomb in our chests, it felt like some cruel joke. What are the odds? But then our family has never had much luck with hearts, have we? Lucia, her father, her uncles, and now us. The specialists laid it out clearly. 6 months, maybe less for the boys. Their condition is advancing faster than mine. 6 months of increasing pain, of losing strength, of watching each other suffer. The medications might buy us a little time, but the end would be the same. Painful. Undignified. One of us watching the others go first, carrying that grief, along with their own pain. So we talked. For days we talked. About life and death, about choices and dignity. About what it means to be masters of our own fate. It was Marco who said it first, that if we had to go, we should go together. On our terms. On the water, where we've been happiest. This isn't despair, Elena. This is love. The three of us making one last choice together. The boys could have had their own lives, their own families by now, but they chose to stay to build their lives alongside mine. We've been a unit since Lucia died. It seems fitting we leave the same way. I'm not asking for understanding or forgiveness. Just know that this choice brings us peace. The storm forecast for tomorrow gives us our opportunity. I'll make it look like an accident so the insurance will pay out. The money will fund research that might help others with our condition. Take care of our house, Elena. It has good memories in its walls. And please, when the shock and hurt fade, tell our story. Not to glorify what we've done, but so people understand that sometimes facing the end, love guides us to difficult choices. There was a pause, the sound of Eduardo taking a deep breath. I wish we'd been closer these past years. That's my greatest regret. But I'm glad it's you who will be our voice when we're gone. I love you, little sister. I always have. The recording ended. Elena sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. The raw honesty in her brother's voice, the love and pain in his words broke her heart all over again. Yet beneath her grief she felt something else, a deep, complicated understanding of the choice they had made. After composing herself, Elena gathered the papers and the recorder and stepped outside. Gabriel was waiting, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats were now heading out for the day's work. Did you listen to it? He asked quietly. Yes, Elena replied. He explained their choice. Gabriel nodded. Eduardo was the best man I ever knew. Whatever decision he made, he would have had his reasons. The letter to the town council, Elena said, holding up the sealed envelope from the packet. Do you know what it contains? No, Gabriel admitted. But knowing Eduardo, it's something to help the community. He always thought of others first. As they walked back along the dock, the sun now fully risen over Pine Harbor, Elena felt a strange sense of peace beginning to form alongside her grief. Her brother and nephews had made an impossible choice, but they had made it together, out of love for each other. Later that day, Elena attended the scheduled town council meeting. The mayor had invited her to say a few words about Eduardo and the twins, but she had something more important to share. When called to speak, Elena approached the podium with Eduardo's letter in hand. My brother left this for you, she said simply, handing it to Mayor Thompson. The mayor opened it and read silently for a moment, his expression changing from curiosity to surprise to deep emotion. Finally, he looked up at the gathered council, members and townspeople. Eduardo has left detailed plans and seed funding for a medical clinic in Pine Harbor, the mayor announced, specifically a cardiac care facility to serve our community and the surrounding areas. He writes that no one from a small town should have to travel hours to the city for specialized care as he and his sons did. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even in death, Eduardo was taking care of the community he loved. After the meeting, Elena walked slowly back to her brother's house, her house now. As she passed through town, people nodded in greeting, some stopping to share yet another story about Eduardo or the twins. With each conversation, Elena felt more connected to the brother she had lost touch with and the nephews she had barely known. That evening, she sat on the porch overlooking the harbor, watching the fishing boats return as the sun began to set. In her hands was Eduardo's journal, open to its final entry. But now, instead of seeing only the tragedy of their choice, she understood the love that had guided it. 3 men bound by blood and heart facing the same fate. 3 men who had lived their lives as one family, choosing to face death the same way. Together, on their own terms, with dignity and love. The story would shock those who learned the full truth, but Elena now understood it was her responsibility to make sure people knew not just how Eduardo and his sons died, but how they had lived, with courage, with purpose, and with unwavering love for each other. In Pine Harbor, their memory would live on, in the clinic that would help others, in the park where children would play, in the stories townspeople would tell for generations to come. And in Elena's heart, where she now carried the full weight and beauty of their final shocking choice, a choice made of love in the face of inevitable loss. As darkness fell over the water, Elena whispered, "Rest easy, Eddie. You and your boys. Your story is safe with me."